arrival and first nights. She arrived with the dry season still braided into her hair, and the smell of smoke and mango clinging to the small suitcase at her feet. The plane had been a blur of clouds and a new kind of fear. The city below had been a glittering, impossible thing she could not name. Her father's hands had been steady when he helped her down the aisle, but his smile had been thin with the weight of a man who had taken a job that would change everything. He had promised a better life, and the promise had the shape of a new apartment, a new school, and a new language that would not always be kind. The apartment was smaller than the house she had left, but it had windows that opened onto a canyon of buildings and a sky that felt both near and far. At night, the city breathed in electric light. The refrigerator hummed like a living thing, and the street lamps made the curtains glow with a color she had never seen. She lay awake the first night, listening to the unfamiliar chorus of distant horns and the steady, mechanical heartbeat of the building's systems. When she reached for the light switch and the room obeyed, a small, astonished laugh escaped her. Electricity felt like a secret the city kept in its walls, a power that could be turned on and off like a story. Her father worked long hours as an engineer, learning codes and systems that made the city run. He came home with pockets full of small receipts and a tiredness that sat in his shoulders. He taught her to respect the hum of machines and to read the little panels that told whether a system was healthy. He showed her how a circuit closed, how a fuse could be coaxed back to life, and how a problem could be solved by patient hands and careful thought. In those evenings, solder smoke and laughter braided together, and she felt a different kind of belonging. The steady logic of cause and effect, the comfort of a problem that could be solved. Her mother's voice came across the phone in the evenings, warm and steady. She spoke of the river and of the way the mango trees bent after the rains, of the neighbor who always left a pot of stew on the fire, and of the small rituals that had kept their family steady. "You are brave," her mother said, and the words were a talisman she tried to hold. But the city had a way of making small things feel fragile. At school, fluorescent corridors felt like tunnels of judgment. Classmates whispered at her accent, at the way she folded her hands, at the stories she told of a house with a thatched roof and a river that sang. She learned quickly that being different made her visible in ways she did not want. The first days were a study in small exposures. She learned the corner store where the woman behind the counter smiled when she tried to say the name of a fruit she had known by another word. She found the library, a cool, quiet place where books smelled like dust and possibility, and she sat for hours with a pencil, copying words until their shapes felt less foreign. She discovered a park where pigeons gathered like gray confessions, and where the grass felt like a soft, forgiving thing beneath her feet. Each small place became a map she could carry in her head, a set of safe points in a city that otherwise felt too large. School, however, was harder than she had imagined. Children could be cruel with a single sentence. They mimicked her speech and turned her stories into jokes. Teachers sometimes looked away, busy with attendance and lesson plans, and she learned to make herself small so she would not be noticed. The taunts were not always loud. Sometimes they were the quiet, persistent kind that settled like dust. She began to believe that specialness was something other people had, not her. Her mother's insistence that she was special felt like a fragile talisman she could not hold. The words slid off her like rain on wax. At home, the apartment's small rituals tethered her. She swept the floor the way her grandmother had taught her, folding the broom's straw with a practiced hand. She boiled water and watched the steam rise, thinking of the rivers missed at dawn. She learned to fold clothes the way her mother had shown her on the phone, each crease a memory of a place that had shaped her. The pendant she had worn since childhood, a small, smooth stone set in a ring of beaten metal, had been tucked into the lining of her suitcase. It had been a gift from her grandmother, who had said, in a voice that smelled of smoke and sweet tea, that the pendant would keep her steady. For a while she kept it wrapped in cloth and hidden beneath her pillow, a private thing she did not yet trust to touch. Her father's work sometimes brought him home with small treasures. A spare bolt that fit a toy she had loved, a scrap of wire that could be bent into a new shape. He taught her to take things apart and put them back together, to see the world as a set of systems that could be understood. In the evenings, they would sit at the small kitchen table, and he would show her how a circuit closed, how a light could be coaxed into life with patient hands. Those lessons were practical and tender. They taught her that the world could be read and that problems could be solved. The city's noise receded for a few hours, and she learned to breathe. But the school's cruelty was a persistent weather. She began to shrink in the hallways, to answer questions in a voice that was careful and small. The teacher's indifference sometimes felt like a second wound. She learned to rely on herself and on the small rituals that kept her steady. Her mother's voice, the one that had always said she was special, became a distant echo she could not always hear. The pendant remained tucked away, a promise she had not yet learned to trust. One rainy afternoon, when the city's sky had the color of old metal and the apartment smelled of wet concrete, she found a small parcel tucked beneath a loose floorboard. It was wrapped in a scrap of cloth that smelled faintly of the river and of smoke. Her heart thudded in a way that felt like a secret as she unwrapped it. Inside lay the pendant she had thought lost, the smooth stone set in beaten metal, worn by years of touch. Her fingers trembled as she held it. The metal was warm from the cloth, and when she pressed the stone to her palm, a memory rose like steam. Her grandmother's hands, the river's edge, the sound of frogs at night. She slipped the pendant into her palm and felt, for the first time in months, a small, stubborn warmth. The city's light seemed less like a threat and more like a pattern she might learn. She carried the pendant with her that night as she lay awake, listening to the apartment's hum. When she reached for the light switch and the room obeyed, she thought of the pendant and of the way her grandmother had said that some things were bridges between times. She did not yet know what she meant, but the idea settled like a seed. The first nights in the city were a study in small, careful acts. Learning the corner store, finding the library, listening to her father's patient explanations of circuits, and holding the pendant like a private talisman. The apartment's hum became a kind of lullaby, and the city's lights a constellation she might one day learn to read. She had not yet become the person she would be, but the small things, the pendant, the solder smoke, the library's quiet, were beginning to stitch a map. In the dark, with the pendant warm in her hand, she allowed herself a single thought that felt like a promise. Perhaps, in time, she would learn to make the city obey in the same way a circuit obeyed a steady hand. First shifts and quiet rules. The pendant had returned like a small, private miracle, and for a while she treated it as such. A thing to be admired in the dark, a secret warmth pressed to her palm. But secrets, even the tender ones, have a way of asking for use. Curiosity arrived like a tide, slow and inevitable. She began with the smallest experiments, the ones that felt least like theft and most like learning. A minute into the past to hear her grandmother's laugh again, an hour into the future to see whether the plant on her windowsill would survive the week. Each test was a careful ritual, a breath, a thought of place, a steadying of the hands, and each time the world folded and opened in ways that made her knees go soft. The first jump that mattered happened on a Tuesday when the sky was the color of dishwater, and the apartment smelled of boiled cabbage from the neighbor below. She had been thinking about the river, about the way the light had fallen on the water the last time she had been home. She closed her eyes, pressed the pendant to her sternum, and let the memory come forward like a tide. The apartment dissolved. For a breath, she stood on the river bank, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and the chorus of frogs. Her grandmother's voice called from the kitchen, and she could see the thatch roof, the way the smoke curled into the sky. She touched the water and felt the cool give of the current against her fingers. Then, as if someone had folded the page, she was back in her bed, the pendant cool and ordinary in her hand. The experience left her trembling with a kind of reverence she had not known she could feel. It was not simply that she could travel. It was that the travel felt like a conversation with time itself. The pendant did not yank her through eras like a thief. It allowed her to step lightly, to listen, to learn. She began to keep a notebook, a small, battered thing she carried in her backpack, and she wrote down the times, the sensations, the rules she discovered by trial and error. Panic blurred the edges of the jumps, calm sharpened them. Intention mattered. So did respect. She learned to treat the pendant as she had been taught to treat the river, with offerings of silence and gratitude. At school, she continued to shrink in the hallways, but the pendant gave her a private laboratory where she could practice being other than small. She used it to rehearse answers before raising her hand, to step forward an hour and listen to a lecture twice until the concepts settled like seeds. She learned to time her jumps so she could attend a class, step forward to review the lecture, and return with the memory of clarity. The work was not cheating in the way she feared. It was a disciplined rehearsal. She set rules for herself and wrote them in the front of the notebook in a careful hand. No changing other people's choices. No erasing consequences that taught lessons. No peeking at private things without consent. The rules steadied her. They turned power into responsibility. Her grades began to climb in a way that felt almost miraculous to those who had watched her struggle. Teachers who had once overlooked her began to ask her to present projects. She accepted with a quiet that surprised even her. The pendant had given her leverage, yes, but it had also given her a new relationship to time, not as a river to be crossed in panic, but as a medium to be learned. She used it to study experiments in slow motion, to watch chemical reactions unfold like small suns, to rehearse lab techniques until her hands moved with the ease of muscle memory. The city that had once felt like a cage opened into a map of opportunities. With opportunity came temptation. The first time she considered bending the rules, it was small and human. A math test she had not prepared for, a question that could be answered if she stepped forward an hour and read the teacher's notes. Her heart hammered at the thought. She imagined the relief, the praise, the way a good grade might make the taunts stop. She pressed the pendant to her palm and felt the familiar warmth. Then she thought of her mother's voice, of the way her grandmother had taught her to return what she took from the land, and she closed the notebook. She would not use the pendant to steal advantage. She would not become the kind of person who took without asking. The rules were not merely moral postures, they were practical safeguards. She learned that small, selfish uses of the pendant had consequences that rippled outward. Once, in a moment of impatience, she had stepped forward to avoid an awkward conversation with a classmate. The conversation had been smoothed, yes, but the classmate's hurt had been deferred. not healed. The memory of the avoidance sat like a stone in her chest. She added a new line to the notebook. Do not avoid the hard work of being present. The pendant could teach her, but it could not replace the messy, necessary labor of human connection. As she matured, her experiments grew bolder but remained careful. She visited archives in the past to read original notes by scientists she admired, tracing the slow, halting steps of discovery. She stepped forward to see how technologies unfolded before they became common, watching the first tentative sketches of devices that would later hum in laboratories. Each visit taught her humility. Discoveries were rarely sudden. They were conversations across time, built by hands that had erred and tried again. She began to write papers that wove historical insight with experimental rigor, and colleagues noticed the unusual depth of her citations and the way she honored sources as living voices. The pendant also taught her the ethics of intervention. When a neighbor's child fell from a fire escape and the world narrowed to the sound of sirens and the smell of smoke, she used the pendant to map exits and to time rescues. She stepped forward and back, coordinating movements with a calm she had practiced in private. The child survived, and the gratitude that followed was a quiet, bright thing. But the experience left her shaken. She had seen how the pendant could save lives, and she had also seen how it could not erase grief. She recorded the event in her notebook with a trembling hand and a new rule beneath her others: use to protect, never to possess. Her father watched these changes with a mixture of pride and concern. He had always been practical, a man who fixed systems and trusted the logic of cause and effect. He noticed the way his daughter's hands moved with new confidence, the way her eyes held a steadier light. He did not know about the pendant at first. She kept it secret, a private talisman between her and the river of time. But one evening, when solder smoke braided with the smell of dinner and the apartment felt like a small, safe world, she told him. She showed him the pendant and the notebook, the careful rules she had written in the margins. He listened without surprise, as if the world had always been full of small miracles that required patient hands. He did not ask for proof. Instead, he offered a different kind of help. He taught her to document rigorously, to keep records that could be shared ethically, and to think about the consequences of knowledge. He reminded her that tools could be used for good or ill, and that the measure of a person was how they chose to use what they had. His words were practical and steady, and she took them into her bones. The pendant remained a private thing, but the rules were now shared. She and her father drafted a set of principles that combined her grandmother's teachings with the engineer's logic: respect, consent, stewardship, and repair. School life shifted as well. The taunts did not vanish overnight, but her new competence made them less sharp. When a boy mimicked her accent, she no longer shrank. She answered with a calm that disarmed him. When a teacher overlooked a student, she raised her hand and spoke with a clarity that came from repeated rehearsal. Her classmates began to see her not as an oddity, but as someone who could be relied upon. Friendships formed slowly, like seedlings pushing through concrete. One girl, Myra, sat with her at lunch and asked about the river. She listened to the stories with a hunger that felt like kinship. The two of them began to walk home together sometimes, sharing small confidences and the kind of laughter that made the city feel less like a machine and more like a place where people could belong. Outside school, she continued to test the pendant's limits with a scientist's curiosity and a child's reverence. She learned that the pendant responded to intention and to a kind of ethical posture. It opened more readily when she approached time as a teacher rather than as a resource to be mined. She used it to rehearse lab techniques, to watch the slow folding of proteins in a simulation she could step into and observe, and to return with notes that made experiments more precise. Her notebooks filled with sketches and observations, with lines of equations, and with the occasional poem her grandmother had taught her. The work felt like a braid of disciplines, the rigor of science and the tenderness of memory. As her competence grew, so did the attention she received. A teacher recommended her for a summer internship at a local university lab. The lab was a bright, humming place where machines sang and where people spoke in a language of acronyms and careful measurements. She accepted with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The internship was intense, long hours, precise protocols, and a culture that prized reproducibility above all. She used the pendant sparingly, mostly to rehearse techniques and to review lectures. The lab's senior researcher noticed her meticulous notes and the way she could anticipate experimental pitfalls. He invited her to present a small poster at a student symposium. She did so with a quiet authority that surprised even her. The symposium was a turning point. She stood before a cluster of students and professors and explained an experiment she had refined, a method for stabilizing a delicate reagent that had confounded the lab for months. She spoke of the steps she had taken, the controls she had used, and the small, iterative changes that had led to success. Her presentation was not flashy. It was steady and precise. Afterward, a professor approached and asked whether she would consider applying for a scholarship. The idea of formal recognition felt strange and wonderful. She thought of her mother's voice, of the river, of the pendant tucked beneath her pillow. She thought of the rules she had written in the notebook. She accepted the professor's offer with a steady hand. That night, walking home with Mara at her side, she felt the city's lights like a constellation she had learned to read. The pendant lay warm in her pocket, a private warmth that reminded her of where she had come from and of the obligations she carried. She had become someone who could move between times with care, who could use the future to learn and the past to honor. The rules she had set were not constraints but commitments, to protect, to teach, to repair. The pendant had changed the shape of her life, but it had not changed the core of who she was. She remained, at heart, the girl who had once pressed her palm to her mother's wrist and promised to mend what was broken. Now she had tools and a community and a ledger of careful rules. The city hummed around her, and she walked through it with a steady step, listening for the next question that would ask her to be brave. The private laboratory. The pendant had become, in the quiet of her room, a small and exacting teacher. She learned its grammar the way one learns a language by immersion, not by rules alone, but by repetition, by the way the mouth shapes a sound until it becomes natural. Each evening she sat on the edge of her bed with the pendant cupped in both hands and practiced the ritual she had invented. 3 slow breaths, a clear image of the place she intended to visit, and a single, steady thought that acted like a compass. She discovered quickly that the pendant answered to attention. When her mind wandered, the edges of time blurred and she returned with nothing but a headache and a sense of wasted hours. When she was precise, the world folded cleanly and she stepped through as if through a curtain. Her notebook filled with the small, exact records of a scientist and the tender notations of a child who still loved stories. She dated each entry and wrote the coordinates of each jump, the hour she left, the place she visited, the sensations that accompanied the shift. She cataloged the smells, river mud, the iron tang of a hospital corridor, the citrus of a market stall, and the textures. The give of a thatch roof under her palm, the slickness of a lab bench, the warmth of a teacher's hand on her shoulder. She learned to trust the pendant's limits. It did not carry her to impossible eras. It moved her along threads that felt connected to her life, to places that had been part of her story or that lay within the reach of the pendant's quiet will. At first, she used the pendant for small, private rehearsals. A math problem that had tangled her mind became a sequence she could step through. She would attend the class, step forward an hour to hear the teacher's explanation again, and return with the memory of the method. She practiced lab techniques in the same way, stepping forward to watch a pipette's arc in slow motion until her hands could mimic it without thought. The pendant made repetition possible in a way that ordinary time did not. She could compress hours of practice into a single afternoon by moving forward and back with care. The effect was not magic so much as apprenticeship accelerated. Muscle memory, conceptual clarity, and the quiet confidence that comes from having seen a problem from multiple angles. But the pendant also taught her restraint. She learned that time, when treated as a resource, could be abused. The first time she used it to avoid an awkward confrontation with a classmate, the relief she felt was immediate and sweet. She stepped forward, smoothed the moment, and returned to find the sting of avoidance lodged in her chest. The classmate's hurt had not vanished. It had been deferred. The pendant had given her a way to escape consequences, but it had not given her a way to heal the underlying wound. She wrote the lesson in the notebook in a hand that trembled. Presence matters. Do not use time to avoid the work of being human. As the months passed, her life acquired a rhythm that balanced ordinary obligations with the secret geometry of her jumps. Mornings were for school and for the small domestic tasks that kept the apartment steady. Sweeping, boiling water, checking the small repairs her father had left for her to practice. Afternoons were for study and for the internship at the university lab, where she learned to read instruments and to respect the slow, patient work of reproducibility. Nights were for the pendant and the notebook, for the private laboratory she had built beneath the hum of the refrigerator and the city's distant roar. Her father noticed the change in her posture and in the way she moved through the world. He saw the steadiness in her hands when she soldered a circuit and the way she could explain a concept with a clarity that made his chest ache with pride. He did not know the full extent of her secret, but he recognized the shape of growth. One evening, after a long day at the lab, she showed him the notebook's careful pages, the dates, the sketches, the rules she had written in the margins. She did not show him the pendant at first. She wanted to see whether he would read the record and understand the discipline behind it. He read slowly, his finger tracing the lines as if they were a map. When she finally revealed the pendant, she expected astonishment or disbelief. Instead, he listened with the quiet attention of a man who had spent his life fixing systems and who understood, in his bones, the logic of tools. He asked practical questions. How did she ensure accuracy? What safeguards did she use? How would she document outcomes? She answered as best she could, and together they drafted a set of protocols that combined her grandmother's teachings with the engineer's logic. They formalized the rules she had already written in the notebook. Never alter another person's choices without consent. Never erase consequences that teach. Use the pendant to protect life, not to possess it. The act of writing the rules together felt like a covenant, a way to anchor the pendant's power in a moral architecture. With the rules in place, She began to use the pendant in ways that extended beyond personal advantage. She volunteered for a community health outreach organized by the university, a modest program that brought basic screenings and education to neighborhoods that lacked easy access to care. The outreach team was small and earnest: a nurse who loved to teach, a graduate student who could explain statistics with a smile, and a coordinator who kept the schedule from unraveling. She joined as an assistant, carrying supplies and learning to take blood pressure with a steady hand. The work was humbling and immediate. People came with stories that did not fit neatly into charts: a cough that had lingered for months, a child who had missed vaccinations, an elder whose mobility had been eroded by years of labor. The pendant became a tool of preparation. Before a clinic day, she would step forward an hour to watch the flow of patients and to anticipate bottlenecks. She would return with a plan: where to set up the table, which pamphlets to bring, how to arrange chairs so elders could rest. The small efficiencies she introduced made the outreach smoother and less stressful for everyone. More importantly, she used the pendant to learn how to listen. She stepped back to revisit conversations she had had with patients, noticing the words they had used and the silences they had left. The practice taught her that care was not only about interventions, but about the quality of attention. One afternoon, during a clinic in a neighborhood that smelled of frying plantains and diesel, a woman arrived with a child who had a fever that would not break. The mother's eyes were rimmed with exhaustion. She had walked for an hour with the child on her hip. The nurse took the child's temperature and frowned. The child's breathing was shallow. The team moved with practiced calm, but the situation felt precarious. She stepped forward an hour to watch the child's course and returned with a plan: a cooling protocol, a schedule for follow-up, and a note to the clinic to prioritize the child for a rapid diagnostic test. The child improved over the next day, and the mother's gratitude was a quiet, bright thing that warmed the team. The experience reinforced a lesson she had learned in the private laboratory: the pendant could amplify care when used to prepare and to protect. Her academic life continued to accelerate. The internship led to a research assistant position, and the research assistant position led to opportunities to co-author small papers and to present at student symposia. She learned to write with precision, to frame a hypothesis, to design controls, and to accept the slow, often frustrating pace of peer review. The pendant did not make the work trivial. It made it possible to iterate more quickly, to rehearse experiments until the technique was reliable. She used it to watch reactions in slow motion, to trace the diffusion of a dye through a gel, to see the moment a cell's membrane ruptured under stress. The visual memory of those moments translated into better protocols and clearer explanations. Yet for all the practical gains, the pendant's deepest lessons were ethical and existential. She learned that time travel, even in small, controlled increments, altered the texture of responsibility. When she stepped into the past to witness a conversation, she felt the weight of being a witness. When she stepped into the future to see the outcome of an intervention, she felt the pull of stewardship. The pendant made her a custodian of possibilities. It taught her to ask not only what she could do, but what she should do. The rules she had written were not constraints, but a moral grammar that shaped her choices. Friendships deepened in the ordinary spaces of school and the lab. Mara remained a steady companion, someone who asked questions without judgment and who laughed easily at the city's absurdities. They studied together, walked home together, and shared small rituals. A cup of tea at the corner store, a quiet hour in the library, a playlist of songs that made the city feel less like a machine and more like a place where people could belong. Mara did not know the full extent of the pendant's power, but she knew the shape of her friend's discipline and the tenderness with which she approached others. The two of them became a small island of trust in a world that often demanded performance. As the seasons turned, the pendant's presence in her life became less like a secret and more like a responsibility she carried with care. She continued to test its limits, to document its effects, and to refine the rules that governed its use. She learned to balance the private laboratory with the public work of care, to let the pendant amplify preparation rather than replace presence. The city's lights no longer felt like a threat. They were a constellation she had learned to read. The river of her childhood remained a touchstone, a place she visited in memory and in the quiet jumps that kept her connected to the people who had shaped her. In the private laboratory beneath the hum of the refrigerator, she wrote a new line in the notebook, one that felt like a vow. Use time to teach, not to possess. Let knowledge be a bridge, not a wall. The pendant warmed in her palm as if in agreement. She closed the notebook, turned off the lamp, and listened to the city breathe. Outside, the night moved with its steady, indifferent rhythm. Inside, she felt the steady pulse of a life being built. A braid of curiosity and care, of rules and tenderness, of a girl who had once been afraid of light and who was learning, slowly and surely, to make it her ally. The public turn. The internship that had once felt like a tentative bridge became, over months, a steady span. The lab's fluorescent light no longer felt alien. It was a different kind of sun, one that revealed molecules and patterns instead of leaves and river currents. She learned to read instruments the way she had learned to read the city, by repetition, by listening to the small noises machines made when they were healthy, by noticing the way a pipette's arc changed when a hand was tired. Her mentor, Dr. Alvarez, was a careful, impatient sort of person who loved precision and hated wasted effort. He noticed her meticulous notes and the way she anticipated problems before they happened. He began to give her more responsibility, a reagent to stabilize, a protocol to refine, a small team to supervise. She accepted the responsibility with a steadiness that surprised even her. The pendant remained a private warmth in her pocket, a tool she used sparingly, and with rules that had hardened into habit. She rehearsed techniques by stepping forward an hour to watch a demonstration twice, 3 times, until the motion lived in her muscles. She used the past to revisit failed runs and to understand where a pipetting error had crept in. She used the future to test whether a change in temperature would alter a reaction's yield. The pendant did not make her work effortless. It made iteration possible in a compressed way. Where other students spent weeks repeating the same trial, she could compress rehearsal into a single afternoon of careful jumps and return with a clarity that felt like mastery. Word spread in small, practical ways. A postdoc who had once struggled with a stubborn reagent asked her for help and left with a protocol she had refined. A graduate student invited her to co-author a methods paper because her notes were unusually clear and reproducible. The lab's senior staff began to rely on her as someone who could see the small details others missed. With each success, the city's lights seemed less like a threat and more like a constellation she could navigate. The pendant's warmth was no longer merely a comfort. It was a responsibility she carried like a compass. Public recognition arrived in modest forms. an invitation to present at a student symposium, a small award for reproducibility, a scholarship recommendation. She accepted each with a quiet that had become her signature. When she spoke at the symposium, she did not boast of secret advantages. She spoke of discipline, of careful documentation, of the ethics of reproducibility. She emphasized the slow, iterative nature of discovery and the importance of honoring the work of those who had come before. Her talk was precise and humane, and afterward, a professor from another department asked whether she would consider a collaborative project. The idea of collaboration felt like a widening horizon. But public life brought new pressures. The same attention that opened doors also invited scrutiny. Colleagues asked questions about her methods, about the speed of her progress, about the uncanny way she seemed to anticipate experimental pitfalls. She answered with the same honesty she had cultivated in the notebook. She described her rehearsal techniques, her careful documentation, her insistence on controls. She did not reveal the pendant. The secret felt too fragile to expose to the glare of curiosity. Yet secrecy has its own cost. It required a constant vigilance, a small performance of normalcy that sometimes left her exhausted. The first serious test of her public ethics came unexpectedly. A biotech startup approached the lab with a proposal, a partnership to scale a promising diagnostic that had been developed in-house. The company's representatives spoke in polished sentences about impact and scale, about the potential to bring a low-cost test to communities that lacked access. The lab's director, who had always been pragmatic, listened with interest. Funding was scarce. The promise of resources for the lab's students and for community outreach was tempting. The proposal included a clause that would allow the company to license certain methods developed in the lab. The language was dense and legal, but the implication was clear. Knowledge could be turned into product, and product could be monetized. She felt a familiar tug, the desire to help many people, the practical need for resources, and the fear that knowledge might be extracted without regard for context. She thought of the river and of the elders who had taught her that gifts from the land carried obligations. She thought of the rules she had written in the notebook and of the covenant she had drafted with her father. She raised questions in the faculty meeting that others had not considered. Who would own the data? How would benefits be shared with communities that had contributed samples or knowledge? Would the methods be stripped of context and sold as a commodity? Her questions were practical and pointed, and they made some people uncomfortable. The director thanked her for her rigor and promised to consider the ethical dimensions. The startup's interest did not vanish. It intensified. Representatives visited the lab, toured the benches, and asked for demonstrations. They were impressed by the reproducibility of certain protocols and by the clarity of the lab's documentation. The company's lawyers drafted a revised agreement that tightened intellectual property clauses and offered a larger funding package. The lab's director, who had been under pressure to secure resources, leaned toward acceptance. The tension in the department grew like a storm cloud. She found herself at a crossroads. The partnership could bring resources that would fund apprenticeships, seed community outreach programs, and support the seed bank she had helped establish with local partners. It could also, she feared, turn methods into products divorced from the cultural contexts that made them ethical. She spoke privately with her father and with Dr. Alvarez. Her father, practical and steady, urged caution and insisted on clear terms that protected community ownership. Dr. Alvarez, who had become a mentor, listened and then offered a different perspective. Science needed resources to scale, but scaling without ethics was a kind of theft. He encouraged her to draft a set of community-first terms and to present them to the director. She did so with the careful logic she had learned from soldering circuits and from the notebook's rules. She proposed a model that required community consent for any use of samples or methods derived from outreach, that mandated benefit-sharing agreements, and that ensured co-authorship and co-ownership for community partners. The proposal was not anti-industry. It was a framework for ethical partnership. The director, after a long deliberation, accepted the terms as a condition for any agreement. The startup balked at some clauses, but ultimately agreed to a pilot that included community oversight and a clause for returning benefits in forms chosen by the communities themselves. The pilot's negotiation felt like a small victory for stewardship. It also marked a turning point in her public role. She was no longer merely a student in the lab. She had become an advocate for ethical science. Her voice carried weight because it was grounded in practice and in a moral grammar she had refined over years of private work. The pilot proceeded with cautious optimism. Funds arrived to support apprenticeships and to expand the outreach program. The lab's work gained visibility, and the community partners received resources to strengthen local capacity. Yet the public turn also brought new vulnerabilities. A journalist, curious about the lab's rapid progress, wrote a profile that praised the team's reproducibility and hinted at a mysterious edge behind their success. The article did not name her, but it set a tone of curiosity that felt like a wind that could scatter secrets. She tightened her circle of trust. She shared the pendant's existence with only two people, her father and Dr. Alvarez. Both listened with the gravity the secret deserved. Dr. Alvarez, who had always been a man of data, asked practical questions about documentation and reproducibility. Her father reminded her of the covenant: respect, consent, stewardship, repair. The pilot's early results were promising. The diagnostics scaled in a way that preserved context and community oversight. Apprenticeships funded by the partnership allowed local practitioners to travel to the lab and to learn techniques that could be adapted to their settings. The seed bank received support to preserve plant varieties threatened by shifting rains. The outreach program expanded, and the small clinics she had helped organize became more resilient. The city that had once felt like a cage now felt like a network of possibilities. Amid the public successes, she continued to use the pendant with the same restraint and reverence. She visited archives in the past to read original lab notebooks of scientists whose names were often reduced to footnotes. She stepped forward to see how technologies had been adopted and adapted in different contexts. Each visit taught her humility. Discoveries were rarely the work of a single genius. They were conversations across time, built by many hands. She began to write papers that wove historical insight with experimental rigor, and colleagues noticed the unusual depth of her citations and the way she honored sources as living voices. The public turn had changed the shape of her life. She moved between the lab and the community, between the city's bright lights and the river's quiet memory. She had become a bridge, a person who could translate between the precise language of instruments and the living grammar of communities. The pendant remained a private warmth in her pocket, a tool she used to teach and to prepare, never to possess. The rules she had written in the notebook were no longer merely personal constraints. They had become a model for ethical practice that others began to notice and slowly to adopt. One evening, after a long day of meetings and bench work, she walked home with Mara and thought about the strange arc of her life. She had arrived in the city with a suitcase that smelled of smoke and mango and a pendant she had not yet learned to trust. Now she carried responsibilities that reached beyond herself, apprentices to mentor, communities to protect, and a lab that had become a small engine of change. The pendant warmed her pocket like a secret promise. She touched it briefly with her thumb and felt the same small, stubborn warmth that had steadied her in the apartment's first nights. The city's lights glowed beyond the river, and she walked toward them steady, listening for the next question that would ask her to be brave. Crisis and reconstruction. The lab hummed like a living thing. Incubators sighed, centrifuges sang their high, patient notes, and the fluorescent lights made everything look a little sharper, as if the world had been turned up a notch in clarity. She had come to love that hum. It was a language she could read now, a rhythm that told her when a machine was tired or when a reagent had been compromised. On a Tuesday that began like any other, the hum shifted into something jagged. A staccato of alarms, a shout down the corridor, the metallic clatter of a tray overturned. She was in the middle of a run, pipetting with the steady hand she had trained into muscle memory, when the lab's emergency lights flicked and the building's intercom crackled. Someone called for an evacuation. Someone else shouted that a chemical spill had occurred in the adjacent room. For a breath, the world narrowed to the smell of solvent and the bright, clinical panic that comes when systems fail. People moved with the practiced choreography of drills and habit, goggles on, doors sealed, protocols recited like prayers. But the spill was worse than anyone had expected. A volatile reagent had been knocked into a waste container, and the fumes spread faster than the ventilation could clear them. In the chaos, a postdoc she had come to respect, a careful, soft-spoken woman named Leela, stumbled, coughing, and fell near the spill. Her face was pale beneath the goggles, and her breath came in shallow, frightened bursts. Someone shouted for a stretcher. Someone else fumbled with the emergency kit. The lab's senior staff barked orders, and the building's safety officer called for an ambulance. She felt the world tilt in a way that had nothing to do with the pendant. The raw, immediate terror of a life in danger, and the helplessness that comes when systems you trust fail. Her training took over first. Check airway, breathing, circulation. She moved with the calm that had been practiced in drills, and in the private rehearsals the pendant had allowed her to compress into hours of muscle memory. She helped clear Leela's airway, applied oxygen, and monitored her vitals. The ambulance arrived and took Leela away, sirens wailing like a thin, urgent thread. The lab emptied into the courtyard, a cluster of faces lit by the pale morning, and the director's voice trembled as he tried to account for what had happened. In the days that followed, the lab was a place of paperwork and quiet accusation. Safety reviews were convened, and the university's compliance office sent a team to investigate. The spill had been traced to a moment of inattention. A tray had been set too close to the edge of a bench during a hurried transfer. It was a human error, the kind that could happen in any lab, but the consequences had been severe. Leela was stable but had suffered chemical exposure that required extended care. The lab's reputation, which had been fragile and newly bright, now felt like a glass object that might crack under scrutiny. For her, the crisis opened a different, more private wound. She had been in the adjacent room when the spill occurred. She had been the one to hand the tray that had been set too close to the edge. In the swirl of activity, she had not noticed the slight wobble of the bench, the way a cable had snagged the tray's corner. The knowledge sat in her like a stone. She could have stepped forward and confessed, but the consequences were not only personal. The lab's funding, the apprenticeships, the community programs, all of it could be jeopardized by a finding of negligence. The ethical grammar she had written in the notebook pressed against her ribs. Presence matters. Do not avoid the hard work of being human. But the ledger of obligations also included the apprentices and the communities who relied on the lab's work. The choice felt like a knife edge. That night, she sat alone in the darkened lab after the others had left, the pendant heavy in her pocket. The hum of the machines had been reduced to a low, sorrowful murmur. She thought of Leela's face, of the way the postdoc had laughed at a joke the week before, of the small kindnesses that had been exchanged over coffee and late nights. She thought of the apprentices who would lose opportunities if the lab's funding were cut. She thought of the covenant she had drafted with her father: respect, consent, stewardship, repair. The rules she had written were not meant to be a shield for cowardice. They were meant to be a compass. The pendant warmed in her palm as if it understood the gravity of the moment. She had used it before to rehearse and to prepare, to compress practice into hours, and to learn from the past without altering it. But the pendant's power had always come with a cost: the temptation to use time to avoid consequences, to smooth over the jagged edges of life. She had vowed not to use it for evasion. Now the temptation returned like a tide. She could step back a few minutes, watch the tray's placement, and then step forward with the knowledge to prevent the spill. She could erase the accident from the lab's record and spare Leela the exposure. She could protect the lab and the apprentices. The logic was seductive and simple. She pressed the pendant to her sternum and felt the familiar tilt. But this time, the ritual felt different. The stakes were not a homework problem or a rehearsal of a pipetting technique. The stakes were a person's health and the integrity of a community's trust. She breathed slowly, recalling the rules she had written in the notebook and the covenant she had made with her father. The pendant's warmth pulsed like a heartbeat. She could use it to change the past. She could also use it to reconstruct it. She chose reconstruction. Instead of stepping back to alter the sequence of events, she stepped back to observe with the clarity she had cultivated. She moved through the minutes like a careful archivist, watching the tray's placement, the cables snag, the moment a hand reached without noticing the wobble. She watched herself hand the tray and saw the micro gesture she had missed: a slight hesitation, a glance toward a phone that had buzzed on the bench. She watched Leela's movement and the way the bench's edge caught the tray's lip. She watched the spill unfold with the cold, clinical attention she used in the lab. The splash pattern, the vapor plume, the way the ventilation responded. When she returned to the present, the notebook in her hand felt heavier. She had not erased anything. She had not altered the past. She had, however, gained a clarity that ordinary memory could not provide. She knew the precise sequence of events and the small, human errors that had combined to create disaster. The knowledge did not absolve her of responsibility, it sharpened it. She could use the pendant to hide the truth, but she could also use it to repair the harm with honesty and with a plan that would prevent future accidents. She drafted a report that night, careful and exacting. She described the sequence she had observed, the contributing factors, and a set of practical interventions. bench reconfiguration to prevent trays from being placed near edges, mandatory phone-free zones during transfers, additional training modules for apprentices on situational awareness, and a redesign of the waste container placement to reduce vapor exposure. She included a personal statement, an admission of her role in the chain of events, and a commitment to lead the implementation of the safety measures. The act of writing the confession felt like stepping into a cold room and letting the air clear. The next morning, she presented the report to Dr. Alvarez and to the director. The room was small and bright, and the director's face was a map of worry. She spoke with the steady clarity she had cultivated. The facts, the sequence, the interventions. She did not mention the pendant. She did not need to. The evidence she presented, the precise timing, the pattern of errors, the practical fixes, was enough to move the conversation from blame to repair. The director listened, his jaw working as he considered the implications. Dr. Alvarez, who had become a mentor and a moral anchor, nodded slowly. He asked practical questions about implementation and about how to involve the apprentices in the redesign. The lab's compliance office accepted the report and the proposed interventions. The university's safety team praised the thoroughness of the analysis and agreed to fund the immediate changes. Leela's recovery was slow but steady. She returned to the lab months later with a cautious smile and a new respect for the rituals of safety. The lab's funding was not cut. The apprentices kept their positions. The outreach programs continued. The pilot with the startup proceeded with a renewed emphasis on safety and community oversight. The confession had cost her something. The knowledge that she had been the proximate cause of the spill sat in her like a scar. But the cost had also been a kind of liberation. She had chosen to use the pendant not to erase, but to understand, and in doing so she had honored the covenant she had written with her father. The rules in the notebook had not been a set of prohibitions, but a moral grammar that guided action. She had learned that power's true test was not whether one could avoid consequences, but whether one could face them and repair the harm done. In the quiet that followed, she added a new line to the notebook. Use time to illuminate, not to erase. Let truth be the foundation of repair. The pendant warmed in her palm as if in agreement. Outside, the city moved with its steady, indifferent rhythm. Inside, the lab hummed again, but the hum had a different quality. A careful, watchful note that spoke of lessons learned and of a community that had chosen to hold itself accountable. She walked through the benches with a steadier step, listening to the machines and to the people who worked beside her, and she felt, for the first time in a long while, that the work she had chosen was not only about discovery, but about the courage to be honest when the world demanded it. Growth and recognition. The months after the spill were a slow, steady work of repair. The lab's benches were rearranged. New signage appeared above sinks and hoods, and the apprentices practiced transfers until their hands moved with a new, careful choreography. The university's safety team ran workshops that felt less like lectures and more like rituals of attention. Checklists read aloud, mock transfers performed with exaggerated care, and debriefs that turned mistakes into lessons rather than into shame. Leela returned to the benches with a cautious smile and a new habit of tapping the emergency stop before beginning a transfer. The community around the lab watched the changes with a mixture of relief and curiosity. The outreach clinics continued, and the pilot with the startup moved forward under the watchful terms she had helped negotiate. For her, the aftermath was also an inward season of consolidation. The confession had cost her sleep and had carved a new seriousness into her days, but it had also clarified something essential. Power without accountability corrodes. She found herself returning to the notebook more often, not to add rules, but to translate them into practice. She taught apprentices how to document not only what they did, but why they did it, how to write methods that could be followed by someone who had never seen the experiment before. She insisted on marginal notes that recorded the small, human choices that shaped outcomes. A hurried lunch, a phone buzzing on a bench, a tired hand. The lab's culture shifted from one that prized speed to one that prized reproducibility and care. Recognition arrived in ways that felt both ordinary and strange. A regional science fair invited her to speak about reproducibility and ethical partnerships. She accepted and prepared a talk that wove together the technical and the human, the logic of controls, the necessity of community consent, and the moral grammar she had learned from her grandmother and her father. She spoke without theatrics, using examples from the lab and from the outreach clinics. The audience, a mix of students, teachers, and local practitioners, listened with an attention that made her feel both exposed and honored. Afterward, a teacher from a nearby high school approached and asked whether she would run a workshop for students who had never seen a lab. The idea of bringing the bench to young people who might otherwise never enter one felt like a small, important bridge. The workshops became a new thread in her life. She and Mara designed hands-on sessions that demystified instruments and emphasized the ethics of practice. They taught students how to pipette with steady hands, how to keep a notebook that told a story, and how to ask questions that honored the people behind the data. The sessions were lively and sometimes chaotic. Teenagers who had never held a micropipette at first treated it like a toy, then learned to respect its precision. Elders from community groups came to observe and to ask practical questions about water testing and sanitation. The workshops were not only about technique, they were about belonging. She watched as students who had once felt invisible found a place at the bench, and she felt a quiet, fierce joy that had nothing to do with awards. Her scholarship applications, once a distant possibility, began to bear fruit. A fellowship offered by a foundation that supported community-engaged science provided funding for a small pilot project. A portable water testing kit co-designed with neighborhood clinics. The fellowship required a proposal that balanced technical rigor with community partnership, and she wrote it with the same care she used in the lab. Clear aims, reproducible methods, and a plan for returning results in forms communities could use. The Foundation's reviewers praised the proposal's ethical framework and its emphasis on co-ownership. The award allowed her to hire 2 apprentices from the outreach program and to purchase equipment that could be taken into neighborhoods rather than requiring people to come to the lab. The portable kit project became a model of the approach she had been refining. She and her team visited community centers, churches, and markets, setting up testing stations and teaching people how to interpret results. They did not arrive as experts with answers. They arrived as partners with tools and a willingness to listen. They learned that water problems were rarely only chemical. They were social and infrastructural. A broken pipe here, a storage practice there, a municipal schedule that left some neighborhoods with stagnant lines. The interventions they designed were practical and local: simple filters, community calendars for testing, and training for local volunteers to run the kits. The work was messy and slow, but it was also deeply satisfying. People who had once been wary of outsiders began to trust the team because the team returned results in ways that respected local knowledge and priorities. Her academic profile grew alongside the community work. Papers followed that combined method development with case studies of community impact. She wrote not only for journals but for local newsletters and for community meetings, translating technical findings into plain language and actionable steps. Colleagues began to cite her work not only for its technical merit, but for its ethical clarity. Invitations to speak multiplied. A panel on science and justice, a radio interview about community labs, a guest lecture at a university across town. Each invitation felt like a small widening of the circle she had been building since the pendant had first warmed in her hand. Yet recognition did not erase the private rules she carried. The pendant remained a secret she shared with only a handful of people: her father, Dr. Alvarez, and once, in a moment of trust, Mara. Each of them had listened and had agreed to the covenant she had written: respect, consent, stewardship, repair. They had seen how she used the pendant to prepare and to teach, not to possess. The secrecy was not a burden so much as a protection. The pendant's existence felt like a fragile thing that required careful handling. She continued to use it sparingly, mostly to rehearse complex protocols or to revisit archival notes that illuminated a method's origin. The pendant's warmth was a private reminder of where she had come from and of the obligations she carried. As her public life expanded, so did the network of people who depended on the lab's work. Apprentices who had once been tentative now led outreach sessions. Community partners who had once been skeptical now co-authored reports and helped design interventions. The pilot with the startup matured into a model for ethical partnership that other labs began to study. The seed bank she had helped support received additional funding to preserve varieties threatened by climate shifts. The city's map of resources grew more connected, and she found herself in the middle of a web that linked benches to neighborhoods, grants to grassroots groups, and lab notebooks to river songs. In quieter moments, she returned to the river in her memory and to the pendant's small warmth. She walked the city's streets with a steadier step, listening to the hum of machines and to the cadence of human voices. The recognition she received was gratifying, but it was not the point. The point, she knew, was the work itself, the slow, patient labor of making methods reliable, of teaching others to care, and of protecting the fragile trust that makes community-engaged science possible. She had arrived in the city as a girl who had been startled by electric light. She had become a woman who could move between times with care and who used that movement to teach, to prepare, and to repair. One evening, after a long day of workshops and bench work, she sat on the lab's roof with Mara and watched the city's lights ripple like a constellation. Mara nudged her and said simply, "You changed things." The words were small and true. She touched the pendant in her pocket and felt its familiar warmth. She thought of the rules in the notebook and of the covenant she had made with her father. She thought of Leela's recovery and of the apprentices who now taught others. The city's lights glowed beyond the river, and she felt, with a quiet certainty, that the work she had chosen was beginning to bend the world in small, necessary ways. Crossroads and choices. The summer after the spill folded into a season of steady work and small triumphs. The lab's new protocols had become habits, Apprentices moved with a choreography that felt less like instruction and more like muscle memory. The outreach kits traveled to markets and churches, to community centers where people gathered with questions, and with the quiet suspicion that outsiders often brought more trouble than help. She and her team listened, tested, taught, and returned results in plain language. The work was slow and sometimes thankless, but it was also honest in a way that made her chest unclench. Recognition continued to arrive in modest forms: invitations to panels, requests to consult on community projects, a small grant to expand the portable testing kit. Each opportunity widened the circle of responsibility she carried. She accepted them with the same careful deliberation she had used when negotiating the pilot with the startup. What were the terms? Who would benefit? And how would the community's voices be preserved? She had learned to ask those questions early, to make ethics a precondition rather than an afterthought. The habit had become part of her professional identity. Yet with growth came new crossroads. A national foundation offered a fellowship that would fund a multi-year project. A network of community labs across the region, each co-designed with local partners and linked to a central research hub. The fellowship promised resources that could transform the outreach program into a durable infrastructure. It promised training, equipment, and a platform for community-led research. The offer felt like a door opening onto a landscape she had only glimpsed in maps and in late-night conversations with Dr. Alvarez and her father. The fellowship's terms were generous but complex. It required a governance structure, a board, and reporting metrics that would satisfy the foundation's auditors. It asked for measurable outcomes and timelines. It required a degree of standardization that risked flattening local practices into check boxes. She convened meetings with community partners, with apprentices, with elders who had come to trust the lab's approach. They sat in a circle in the fellowship room, the air thick with coffee and the low hum of the city beyond the windows. She presented the fellowship's terms and listened as people spoke. Some were eager. The apprentices saw opportunities for stable employment and for training that could be taken back to their neighborhoods. Community leaders imagined labs that could test water, monitor air quality, and provide a base for local health initiatives. Others were wary. They had seen programs come and go, promises made and then withdrawn. They worried that a large foundation might impose priorities that did not match local needs. They feared that the governance structure would place decision-making power in distant hands. She felt the familiar tug between scale and stewardship. The pendant in her pocket felt like a small, private weight, a reminder of the covenant she had written with her father. She had learned to use time as a teacher, not as a tool for erasure. Now she needed to use her skills of negotiation and her moral grammar to shape a partnership that would honor local voices. She drafted a proposal that reframed the fellowship's metrics. Instead of top-down targets, she proposed community-defined outcomes. Instead of a centralized board, she proposed a rotating council with seats reserved for community partners. Instead of a rigid timeline, she proposed iterative milestones co-created with local stakeholders. The Foundation's program officer read the revised proposal with a careful face. There were moments when she feared the officer would reject the changes as impractical. Instead, the officer asked questions about accountability and about how the rotating council would function. They negotiated for weeks, drafting charters and conflict resolution procedures, and she found herself in a new role, not only a scientist but a mediator, a translator between institutional language and the lived priorities of neighborhoods. The fellowship was awarded with the revised terms intact. The victory felt like a small miracle, resources that arrived on the Foundation's schedule but under the community's governance. The network that grew from the fellowship was not a single thing but a constellation. Each community lab had its own rhythm and its own priorities. Some focused on water quality, others on air monitoring, others on food safety. The central hub provided training, quality control, and a platform for shared learning. She traveled between sites, teaching workshops on reproducibility and on ethical engagement, listening to local practitioners who taught her as much as she taught them. The work was messy and beautiful. A woman in one neighborhood who had learned to run the portable kit and who now led a weekly testing circle. A youth group in another who used the lab's data to advocate for municipal repairs. An elder who insisted that every test result be accompanied by a story about the place the water came from. As the network matured, so did the questions that accompanied it. A municipal official asked whether the data from the community labs could be used in regulatory hearings. The question was practical and fraught. On one hand, the data could empower communities to demand repairs and to hold authorities accountable. On the other hand, using community-generated data in formal regulatory contexts required rigorous validation and careful chain-of-custody procedures. She convened a working group that included community partners, legal advisors, and municipal representatives. They developed protocols that allowed community data to be used in advocacy while preserving the community's control over how and when it was shared. The process was slow and sometimes contentious, but it produced a model that balanced rigor with local sovereignty. Her public profile continued to grow. She was invited to speak at conferences and to consult on projects in other cities. Each invitation required a negotiation. How to ensure that any collaboration respected the covenant she had written with her father and the rules in her notebook. She refused some offers that felt extractive and accepted others that promised genuine partnership. The pendant remained a private warmth in her pocket, a reminder of the girl who had once been startled by electric light and who had learned to move through time with care. Amid the professional expansion, her personal life deepened in quiet ways. Mara and she grew closer, their friendship a steady harbor in a life that often demanded performance. They shared small rituals, a weekly dinner at a corner restaurant where the owner knew their orders by heart, a late-night walk along the river where they talked about books and about the people they had met. Mara's curiosity and blunt kindness were a balm. She did not know the full extent of the pendant's power, but she knew the shape of her friend's discipline and the tenderness with which she approached others. Their friendship was a reminder that the work she did was not only about systems and data, but about the human ties that made those systems meaningful. Her father's health, however, began to show the first signs of age. He still worked when he could, fixing small appliances for neighbors and teaching apprentices the basics of circuitry. But he tired more easily, and there were nights when he returned from a job with a stiffness in his hands that took longer to ease. She visited him more often, bringing meals and sitting with him as he told stories about the river and about the first time he had seen a city from a distance. He listened to her talk about the network of community labs with a quiet pride that made her chest ache. He reminded her, in his practical way, that stewardship required not only vision, but also the capacity to rest and to pass responsibilities on. The question of succession began to take shape in her mind. The network could not depend on a single person's energy forever. She began to mentor leaders within each community lab, to help them develop governance skills, and to create training modules that could be taught by local practitioners. She worked with the rotating council to design a leadership pipeline that emphasized local ownership, and that included mechanisms for conflict resolution and for the protection of data sovereignty. The work of building institutions felt different from the thrill of discovery. It was slower, more administrative, and yet it carried the promise of durability. One autumn evening, as the city's air cooled and the river's surface took on the color of old metal, she received a message that would test the network's resilience. A neighboring region had experienced a sudden spike in waterborne illness. The local clinics were overwhelmed, and the municipal response was slow. Community leaders in the affected area reached out, asking whether the network could help with rapid testing and with designing interventions. The request was urgent and practical. It required mobilizing kits, training volunteers, and coordinating with clinics that were already stretched thin. She convened an emergency meeting with the rotating council and with representatives from the affected region. They moved quickly, drawing on the protocols and the relationships they had built. Kits were packed and shipped. Volunteers were trained in rapid deployment. Local leaders were given the authority to adapt protocols to their context. She used the pendant sparingly, stepping forward only to rehearse logistics and to anticipate bottlenecks. The network's response was not instantaneous, but it was swift by the standards of community mobilization. Within days, testing stations were set up, and data began to flow. The intervention revealed both the strengths and the limits of the model. The rapid testing identified contamination points and helped prioritize repairs, but it also exposed infrastructural failures that required municipal investment. The network's data provided leverage for advocacy, and community leaders used it to press for repairs and for targeted support. The crisis also underscored the importance of local capacity. Neighborhoods that had invested in training and in local leadership were able to respond more effectively than those that had not. The experience reinforced her conviction that durable change required both technical tools and the slow work of building local institutions. In the quiet after the emergency, she sat on the lab's roof with Mara and watched the city's lights ripple like a constellation. The network had been tested and had held. The fellowship's resources had been used in ways that honored community priorities. The pendant in her pocket felt like a small, private talisman that had guided her toward choices that balanced ambition with care. She thought of her father's hands, of the apprentices who now led outreach sessions, and of the elders who had insisted that every test result be accompanied by a story about the place the water came from. The work was far from finished, but the network had become a living thing with roots in many hands. She added a new line to the notebook that night, one that felt less like a rule and more like a prayer. Build so others can stand. Leave room for roots to grow. The pendant warmed in her palm as if in agreement. Outside, the city moved with its steady, indifferent rhythm. Inside, the network hummed with the quiet energy of people who had chosen to care for one another. She walked through the lab with a steadier step, listening to the machines and to the voices of the people who worked beside her. And she felt, with a deep and steady certainty, that the work she had chosen was beginning to bend the world in small, necessary ways. The archive and the long view. The network's success brought invitations that felt like doors opening onto rooms she had only glimpsed in maps, archives, libraries, and collections where the slow work of knowledge had been recorded in ink and in the careful hand of those who had come before. She had always loved books. The library where she had first learned the shapes of new words had been a refuge, but now she approached archives with a new hunger. The pendant, which had once been a private talisman for rehearsals and small rescues, became a disciplined instrument for historical listening. She used it to step into the margins of experiments, to read notebooks in the hands of their original authors, and to learn how discoveries had been argued into being across years of failure and revision. Her first archival visit was to a university basement where boxes of lab notebooks lay like sleeping things. The archivist, a woman with a soft voice and a fierce patience, unlocked a climate-controlled room and showed her how to handle paper that had been touched by hands now gone. She pressed the pendant to her palm and stepped back a few decades, not to change anything but to stand beside a young researcher as she recorded a failed run and the small, stubborn observation that later became the seed of a method. The young researcher's handwriting was cramped and urgent. She underlined a line and drew a small diagram in the margin. When she returned to the present, the diagram made sense in a way it had not before. The past had not been a single flash of genius, but a slow conversation between curiosity and constraint. These archival visits reshaped her sense of authorship. She had once imagined that breakthroughs arrived like lightning bolts, sudden and solitary. The notebooks taught her otherwise. Discovery was iterative, communal, and often anonymous. She began to cite not only published papers, but the marginalia of technicians and the careful logs of graduate students. Her writing changed. It became a weave of voices across time, a practice of naming the many hands that had shaped an idea. Colleagues noticed the depth of her references and the humility in her prose. Funders and reviewers began to ask how she could replicate that depth at scale. How could a network of community labs honor the slow, often invisible labor that undergirded scientific progress? She answered with practice. The rotating council adopted a policy that required documentation of not only methods, but of the people who performed them and the contexts in which they were developed. Apprentices were taught to write marginal notes. Who had been present, what small choices had been made, and what uncertainties remained. The policy was not merely bureaucratic, it was a cultural shift. It recognized that reproducibility depended on the stories that accompanied data, and that ethical science required honoring the labor behind results. Her archival work also deepened her sense of time as a resource that could be stewarded rather than exploited. She used the pendant to visit future conferences she might attend, not to steal ideas, but to rehearse questions and to imagine collaborations that honored local priorities. She stepped forward to see how a proposed intervention might be received in a community 5 years hence, and she returned with notes that tempered ambition with patience. The pendant's power, she had learned, was most useful when it amplified listening rather than when it amplified control. One afternoon, while leafing through a box of correspondence from a mid-century public health campaign, she found a letter that made her breath catch. It was from a field worker who had written, in a cramped hand, about the difficulty of convincing a village council to accept a new water treatment. The letter described not only the technical steps, but the songs sung at dusk to explain the change, the cups of tea shared to build trust, and the way the worker had learned to listen before speaking. The letter's author had been anonymous in the published reports. Here, in the margins, the human labor was visible. She stepped back to the moment the letter described, feeling the heat of the sun and the weight of a kettle, and she returned with a renewed conviction. Technical fixes without cultural attention were brittle. The conviction shaped a new project, a living archive that would collect not only methods and data, but stories, songs, and the practical wisdom of those who had implemented interventions. She proposed the project to the rotating council and to community partners. The idea was simple and radical. Create a shared repository where lab notebooks sat beside oral histories, where a protocol's steps were accompanied by the song that had soothed a clinic's waiting room, and where apprentices could learn the social choreography that made interventions durable. The proposal required resources and careful governance. It required consent protocols and a commitment to return the archive's benefits to the communities who contributed. The council embraced the idea, and the foundation provided seed funding to pilot the archive. Building the archive was slow, tender work. Teams traveled to neighborhoods with recording kits and notebooks, inviting elders and volunteers to tell the stories behind the data. They recorded a woman who had taught a neighborhood how to boil water without losing the taste of the river. They transcribed a midwife's lullaby that had calmed mothers during long nights. They photographed the way a community had arranged its testing station to make elders feel welcome. Each entry was accompanied by metadata: who had told the story, when it had been recorded, and how the knowledge had been used. The archive's interface was deliberately simple, a map that allowed users to find stories by place, by practice, and by the people who had contributed them. The archive changed the network's practice in subtle ways. When a team prepared to introduce a new filter design, they consulted the archive not only for technical precedents, but for stories about how similar changes had been explained in neighboring communities. They learned that a demonstration accompanied by a shared meal and a song was more likely to be adopted than a lecture. They learned to ask permission not only for samples, but for the right to tell a story. The archive became a living pedagogy. Apprentices learned to read methods and to listen to the human contexts that made those methods meaningful. Her own scholarship deepened as well. She wrote papers that wove archival insight with experimental data, arguing that reproducibility required social documentation as much as technical controls. The papers were read not only by scientists, but by community organizers and by municipal planners. They sparked conversations about how institutions could fund the slow work of documentation and how funders could value the labor of storytelling. The archive's pilot sites reported that interventions designed with archival insight were more durable and more trusted. Amid the intellectual work, her personal life continued to be a source of grounding. Her father's hands had grown slower, but his eyes still brightened when she described a new story she had recorded. He liked to sit with the archive's map and point to places he had once known in the river's basin, connecting the dots between memory and method. Mara remained a steady companion, and the two of them sometimes sat in the archive's quiet room, listening to recordings of elders' songs and laughing at the small, human details that made science feel less like a machine and more like a conversation. The pendant remained a private warmth in her pocket, but its role had shifted. It was no longer primarily a tool for rehearsal. It was a disciplined instrument for historical empathy. She used it to stand beside the hands that had labored before her, to read marginalia with the patience of someone who knew that knowledge is a conversation across time. The archive, like the pendant, taught her that stewardship required humility. To name the many hands that had built an idea, to return benefits to those who had contributed, and to design interventions that honored the stories that made communities whole. One evening, as rain began to stitch the city's lights into a soft blur, she sat in the archive's listening room and pressed the pendant to her palm. She stepped back to a moment recorded in a field notebook. A woman teaching a child to test water with a simple kit, her voice patient and exact. She listened to the woman's instructions and to the child's small questions, and she returned with a sense of continuity that felt like a benediction. The archive hummed softly around her, a constellation of voices that made the network's work feel less like a project and more like a long conversation. She added a new line to her notebook, one that felt like a promise: honor the past, teach the future, let stories be the scaffolding of science. The pendant warmed in agreement, and she closed the notebook, ready for the next question that would ask her to listen. Personal costs and quiet reckonings. The network had become a living thing, a constellation of labs and listening posts that hummed with the steady work of people who had learned to care for one another. Yet even living things require tending, and the more she gave of herself to the work, the more she felt the small, accumulating costs of attention. There were nights when the city's lights felt like a chorus of obligations, each bulb a reminder of a meeting, a deadline, a promise. There were mornings when her father's hands trembled as he tightened a screw, and she felt the tug of two loyalties: to the communities that had come to rely on the labs, and to the man who had taught her how to coax a circuit into life. Her father's health declined in ways that were slow and stubborn. He still fixed radios and small appliances for neighbors, but the jobs took longer and left him more tired. She found herself arriving at his door with groceries and with the quiet patience of someone who had learned to measure time in small increments. He would sit at the kitchen table and tell stories about the river, the way the water had once cut a path through the land, the names of fish that had been abundant before the rains shifted. And she would listen, sometimes stepping forward in time with the pendant to rehearse a lecture she would give the next week, sometimes simply holding his hand and letting the conversation be ordinary. The tension between public duty and private care was not new, but it sharpened into a moral question that could not be deferred. She had built institutions precisely so that the work would not depend on a single person's energy, but institutions still needed leaders who could hold the threads together. She began to think about succession in practical terms. Who would lead the rotating council when she could not? How would apprentices be supported if funding cycles shifted? And how would the network preserve the covenant that had guided its earliest days? The questions were administrative and intimate at once. At the same time, the network's visibility attracted new kinds of attention. A rival lab in another city, well-funded, with glossy reports and a director who loved headlines, began to publish papers that echoed some of the methods her team had refined. The papers were technically competent, but they lacked the social documentation and the archival depth that had become her network's hallmark. The rival lab's director praised rapid scaling and market-ready solutions. He spoke of impact in terms of numbers and contracts. The contrast was stark. One model that prized speed and productization, another that insisted on slow, contextualized work. The rivalry was not merely academic. The rival lab's funders began to court the same municipal partners and to propose centralized solutions that promised quick fixes. City officials, under pressure to show results, found the allure of rapid metric seductive. She found herself in meetings where the language of urgency threatened to flatten the careful governance structures she had fought to build. She argued for patience and for community-defined outcomes, but the political rhythm of the city sometimes favored spectacle over stewardship. The pressure mounted in a different register when a young journalist, hungry for a story that would capture the public imagination, began to ask questions about the network's secret sauce. The journalist's tone was not malicious at first. She wanted to understand how a small team had managed to scale community labs across neighborhoods. But curiosity can become a blade when wielded without care. The journalist's editor pushed for a narrative that would pit grassroots ethics against corporate efficiency, and the piece that eventually ran in a weekend magazine framed the network as an anomaly. Admirable, perhaps, but quaint in the face of industrial solutions. The article did not name the pendant. No journalist could have known of that private warmth, but it hinted at an edge behind the network's success. The piece quoted a few of her colleagues and a community leader who praised the archive's depth, but it also included a skeptical voice from a municipal official who wondered whether the network's insistence on local governance would slow necessary action. The piece circulated widely, and with it came a new wave of inquiries. From funders who wanted faster metrics, from municipal staff who wanted centralized dashboards, and from academics who wanted to study the model without necessarily adopting its ethical commitments. The scrutiny was exhausting. She found herself spending hours drafting responses that emphasized the network's values and the practical reasons for its governance choices. She convened the rotating council, and they drafted a public statement that explained their approach, rigorous methods, community co-ownership, and a living archive that honored the labor behind data. The statement was careful and clear, but it did not silence the larger conversation about scale and speed. The city's political currents continued to push for solutions that could be measured in quarterly reports. Amid the external pressures, a more intimate challenge arrived. One of the apprentices, a young man named Tarek who had grown up in a neighborhood the network served, began to show signs of restlessness. Tarek was brilliant in the lab. His hands were steady, his notes meticulous, and his curiosity boundless. But he also carried the impatience of someone who had seen infrastructural neglect up close and who wanted immediate change. He began to question the network's slow, deliberative processes. "People are sick now," he told her one afternoon as they walked between testing stations. "We can't wait for councils and rotating boards. We need to push harder." Tarek's urgency was not wrong. It was the voice of a generation that had little patience for incrementalism when lives were at stake. She listened and tried to hold both truths. That urgency demanded action, and that action without consent could do harm. She offered Tarek a role that channeled his energy. Lead a rapid response training program that would equip local volunteers to run testing stations and to advocate for immediate repairs. The program would be accountable to the rotating council, and would include protocols for data validation. Tarek accepted, and for a while the work channeled his restlessness into practical gains. But the strain of balancing competing demands, the city's appetite for quick wins, the rival lab's pressure, the journalist's curiosity, and Tarek's impatience began to show in small ways. She slept less, her notebook's margins filled with hurried notes, and she found herself snapping at Mara over small things. The pendant's warmth in her pocket felt less like a talisman and more like a reminder of the covenant she had made, to steward power with humility. She began to wonder whether the secret she carried was a gift or a burden. The pendant had given her leverage, yes, but it had also made her a target for expectations she had not asked for. The personal costs were not only emotional. Her father's health worsened. A diagnosis of a chronic condition required more frequent visits to the clinic and a regimen of medications that strained their modest finances. She found herself juggling grant reports with pharmacy runs, conference calls with doctors' appointments. The network's governance structures were designed to survive without her constant presence, but institutions still needed people who could hold relationships together. She began to think seriously about delegation and about the painful possibility of stepping back from day-to-day leadership. The decision to step back was not an abdication, but a strategic move. She convened a retreat with the rotating council and the network's senior practitioners. They spent 2 days in a community center outside the city, a place where the air smelled of wood smoke and where the river's memory felt close. They mapped leadership roles, identified potential successors, and designed a mentorship program that would rotate responsibilities among local leaders. She proposed a phased transition. She would remain as a strategic advisor while apprentices and community leaders took on operational roles. The council agreed, and the plan felt like a relief and a risk at once. The transition required trust. She had to trust that the covenant she had helped write would be honored by others, and she had to trust herself to let go. She also had to confront a private fear, that without her careful stewardship, the network's ethical commitments might fray under political pressure. The fear was real, but it was also a test of the very principles she had tried to institutionalize. If the network could not survive beyond her presence, then it had not been a network at all. As the transition unfolded, she found small moments of grace. Tarek's rapid response program matured into a nimble unit that could deploy kits and training within hours of a reported outbreak. A community leader in a distant neighborhood used the archive to design a culturally resonant campaign that increased testing participation. Her father, though weaker, smiled with pride when she described a new apprenticeship cohort that included young people from his neighborhood. Mara remained a steady presence, a friend who could hold the messy edges of her life without judgment. The pendant, which had once been a private instrument of rehearsal, became a quiet companion in this season of handing over. She used it less for tactical advantage and more for perspective, stepping forward to see how a proposed governance change might play out 5 years hence, stepping back to listen to a conversation she had had with a community elder and to hear what she had missed. The pendant's power felt less like a secret weapon and more like a lens that sharpened her capacity to listen across time. One evening, after a long day of meetings and a visit to her father's clinic, she sat on the lab's roof with Mara and watched the city's lights ripple like a constellation. The rival lab's director had published another paper, and the city's political winds still shifted unpredictably. Yet beneath the noise, The network hummed with the steady work of people who had learned to care for one another. She touched the pendant in her pocket and felt its familiar warmth. She thought of the covenant she had written with her father, of the rules in her notebook, and of the apprentices who now led outreach sessions. The costs of the work were real and ongoing, but so were the gains. Communities that could test their water, apprentices who could teach others, and a living archive that honored the many hands behind each intervention. She had learned that stewardship required not only vision, but also the courage to step back and to trust others to carry the work forward. The city's lights glowed beyond the river, and she felt, with a quiet steadiness, that the network she had helped build could survive the tests of time, not because of a single secret pendant, but because of the many hands that had chosen to hold one another steady. Reckoning and return. The years had braided themselves into a pattern she could read. Meetings and field trips, archive visits and rooftop conversations, the steady pulse of apprentices learning to hold a pipette with care. Yet beneath the rhythm there was a deeper current pulling at her, a sense that the work she had built needed not only stewardship, but also a reckoning with the place she had come from. The river in her memory had become more than a childhood landscape. It was a living ledger of the problems she now tried to solve. The spike in waterborne illness, the elders' stories in the archive, the apprentices who had grown into leaders, all of it pointed toward a truth she could no longer postpone. The work of science and care must meet the places that had shaped her. She began to plan a return visit to the region where she had been born. It was not a sentimental journey, but a strategic one. A chance to test whether the methods and governance models she had refined in the city could be adapted to contexts with different infrastructures and histories. The rotating council supported the idea, and community partners offered to help design a respectful itinerary. She insisted on a collaborative approach. Local leaders would set priorities, apprentices would travel as equals, and the archive team would document not to extract, but to return knowledge in forms the communities could use. The trip was arranged with the same care she applied to lab protocols. Kits were packed, training materials translated into local dialects, and consent forms prepared in plain language. She used the pendant sparingly, stepping forward only to rehearse logistics and to anticipate bottlenecks in supply chains. The pendant's warmth felt like a steadying hand on her shoulder rather than a secret to be wielded. She wanted the visit to be an act of listening and of mutual learning, not a demonstration of expertise. When she arrived, the river greeted her with the same old music: frogs, the low hum of insects, and the distant call of someone hauling water. The village had changed in small ways, a new concrete well here, a solar panel there, but the rhythms of daily life were familiar. People recognized her father's name and greeted her with a mixture of curiosity and warmth. She felt the old, complicated knot of belonging and distance. She had left and returned with new tools and new responsibilities, and the balance between those things required humility. The first meetings were slow and careful. She sat in circles under mango trees and listened as elders described the seasons, as mothers spoke of children who missed school because of illness, and as youth leaders asked blunt questions about sustainability and jobs. She presented the portable testing kit not as a cure, but as a tool that could help communities ask better questions about their water. She emphasized co-design. The community would decide what to test, how to interpret results, and what interventions to try. The approach was familiar to her, but here it required translation into practices that honored local governance and ritual. The archive team recorded songs and stories, but they did so with consent and with a promise. Every recording would be returned in a form the community could use: printed transcripts, audio copies for elders, and a local kiosk where people could access the materials without needing internet. Apprentices from the city worked alongside local volunteers, teaching them how to run the kits and how to keep careful notebooks. The work was collaborative and messy. A pump that needed repair, a filter design that required local materials, a schedule that had to fit market days and prayer times. Each problem demanded a solution that respected local rhythms. One evening, after a long day of testing and conversation, an elder took her aside and handed her a small, wrapped bundle. Inside was a pendant, not the one she carried, but a simple carved stone on a cord worn smooth by years of touch. The elder's eyes were steady. "We have always known," he said in a voice that carried the weight of many seasons. "You left with a promise. You have returned with tools. Remember that the river remembers those who listen." The gesture was not mystical so much as relational, a recognition that her work was accountable to the people and places that had shaped her. The visit yielded practical gains. Testing identified contamination points tied to a municipal pipe that leaked into a shallow well. The data, documented with chain-of-custody protocols and accompanied by oral histories that explained how the well had been used, gave local leaders leverage to petition for repairs. The municipal authority, when presented with clear evidence and a coalition of local voices, allocated funds for targeted repairs. The interventions were not instantaneous miracles. They were incremental changes that reduced exposure and improved trust. The apprentices returned to the city with new stories and with a deeper sense of why the archive and the covenant mattered. The trip also forced a personal reckoning. She visited the house where she had grown up and sat by the riverbank where she had once learned to listen to water. The pendant in her pocket felt warm and small, a reminder of the girl who had been startled by electric light and who had learned to move through time with care. She thought of her grandmother's hands and of the promise that had been given and kept. The return was not a closure, but a continuation, a renewal of obligations, and a confirmation that the work she had built could be rooted in the places that had shaped her. Back in the city, the network integrated lessons from the trip. The archive added new entries that documented not only methods, but the governance practices that had made interventions durable. The rotating council revised training modules to include cultural translation and community negotiation. The fellowship's metrics were adjusted to value long-term trust building as much as immediate outputs. The changes were small but meaningful. A grant application that included a budget line for community storytelling, a training manual that began with listening exercises, and a new apprenticeship exchange that allowed local leaders to visit the central hub. Her father's health continued to decline, and she spent more time at his side. He listened to her stories of the trip with a quiet pride that made her chest ache. He reminded her, in his practical way, that the work of repair required patience and the willingness to teach others to carry the load. She began to step back more deliberately from day-to-day leadership, mentoring successors and trusting the systems she had helped build. The pendant remained a private warmth, but its role had shifted again. It was now a reminder of obligations rather than a shortcut to outcomes. In the months that followed, the network's model gained attention from other regions seeking to adapt it. She traveled as an advisor, not as a director, helping communities design governance structures that honored local priorities. The pendant's secret remained with her, a private instrument of perspective rather than power. She had learned that the true leverage of her life was not the ability to move through time, but the capacity to build institutions that could hold the work across generations. One night, on the lab's roof, she opened her notebook and wrote a line that felt like a benediction. Return with tools, leave with roots. Let the work be carried by many hands. The pendant warmed in agreement. The city's lights glowed beyond the river, and she walked toward them steady, listening for the next question that would ask her to be brave and to teach others how to be brave too. Shadows and safeguards. The network's momentum carried with it a new kind of gravity. Not only the pull of projects and partnerships, but the weight of expectations that gathered like weather around any visible success. Invitations multiplied, and with them came a parade of proposals, each promising scale, each asking for a piece of the model she had helped build. Some offers were generous in spirit and in resources. Others arrived with clauses that smelled faintly of extraction. She had learned to read contracts the way her father read circuit diagrams, to look for hidden connections and for points where a single loose wire could short the whole system. One autumn morning, an email arrived from a philanthropic consortium that had funded high-profile public health initiatives across the globe. Their proposal was tempting. A multi-year grant that would underwrite the network's expansion into neighboring regions, with a promise of sustained funding and a platform for national visibility. The grant's language was polished and persuasive, and the consortium's representatives spoke of impact at scale. But buried in the fine print were expectations that made her uneasy. Centralized reporting dashboards, proprietary data formats, and a clause that allowed the consortium to sublicense aggregated data to third parties for research and development. She convened the rotating council and the network's legal advisors. The conversation was long and exacting. Community partners worried that data shared without careful governance could be used to stigmatize neighborhoods or to justify punitive policies. Apprentices feared that the network's hard-won practices might be flattened into metrics that obscured the human labor behind them. She listened and then proposed a path forward that reflected the covenant she had written with her father. Accept the funding only if the consortium agreed to community-first data governance, to open-source reporting formats, and to a clause that required any sublicensing to be approved by the rotating council and by the communities whose data would be involved. Negotiations stretched for weeks. The consortium's program officers were polite but insistent. They argued that standardized dashboards were necessary for national policy uptake and for attracting additional funders. She argued back with the language of practice, that data divorced from context could be weaponized, that communities deserved control over how their stories were told, and that trust was not a metric to be optimized, but a relationship to be stewarded. The rotating council backed her, and the apprentices drafted a technical appendix that explained how community-defined metadata could be embedded in data sets to preserve provenance and consent. In the end, the consortium agreed to a revised memorandum of understanding that preserved community governance and required open formats. The victory felt hard-won and fragile. She celebrated quietly with Mara and with a small group of apprentices, but the relief was tempered by the knowledge that vigilance would be ongoing. The network's survival depended not only on securing resources, but on guarding the ethical architecture that made those resources meaningful. The episode also revealed another shadow, the risk of internal fracture. As the network grew, so did the diversity of perspectives within it. Some members favored rapid expansion to reach more people. Others insisted on deep, slow work that prioritized local sovereignty. The rotating council had been designed to hold these tensions, but governance is a practice, not a guarantee. Disagreements flared over priorities. Whether to prioritize a new urban pilot that promised visibility or to invest in a remote region where infrastructure would be harder to build, but where the need was acute. She found herself mediating not only with external actors, but within the network's own heart. She convened listening sessions, facilitated conflict resolution workshops, and insisted on transparent decision-making processes. The work of governance required patience and the willingness to sit with discomfort. She used the pendant sparingly in these moments, not to manipulate outcomes, but to rehearse conversations, to anticipate misunderstandings, and to return with notes that helped the council craft compromises that honored both urgency and care. Amid the governance work, a quieter, more personal reckoning unfolded. Her father's condition worsened. The medications helped but did not restore the vigor of his younger years. She found herself at his bedside more often, holding his hand as he slept and listening to the stories he told in fragments. He asked about the apprentices, about the river, about the archive, and she answered with the steady patience she had learned in the lab. One evening, he took her hand, and with a clarity that surprised them both, asked whether she had ever considered what would happen to the pendant if she were gone. The question landed like a stone. She had never imagined the pendant as an heirloom in the ordinary sense. It had been a private instrument, a tool for perspective and for preparation. But her father's question reframed it as a responsibility that could outlive her. She thought of the covenant, of the rules in her notebook, and of the apprentices who had become leaders. She thought of the archive and of the many hands that had built the network. The pendant's existence had always been guarded because of the risks it posed if misused. Now she had to consider its stewardship beyond her own life. She convened a small, confidential council. Her father, Dr. Alvarez, and two apprentices she trusted implicitly. They met in the lab's quiet conference room, the pendant wrapped in cloth and placed on the table between them like a sleeping thing. She explained her father's question and proposed a plan. The pendant would remain a private instrument, its existence known only to a small circle bound by the covenant. Succession would not be a single handoff, but a ritualized process of mentorship and ethical testing. Candidates would be evaluated not only for technical skill, but for their commitment to the covenant's principles: respect, consent, stewardship, and repair. The council agreed, and they drafted a protocol that combined apprenticeship, ethical review, and a public commitment to transparency about governance, not about the pendant's existence, but about the values that would guide its use. The protocol felt like a compromise between secrecy and accountability. It acknowledged that some tools require guarded stewardship, while insisting that the values guiding their use be public and robust. She felt a weight lift from her chest. The pendant remained a private warmth in her pocket, but its future was now anchored in a process that could outlast any single person. As the seasons turned, the network continued to evolve. New apprentices arrived with fresh energy and new questions. The archive grew richer with stories and with the metadata that preserved provenance. The fellowship's resources allowed for deeper investments in training and in local leadership pipelines. She traveled less as a director and more as an advisor, helping communities adapt the model to their contexts. The pendant's role in her life shifted from a tactical instrument to a moral compass, a reminder that power must be stewarded and that the true measure of success is the capacity to teach others to carry the work. Yet the world beyond the network's careful architecture remained unpredictable. A municipal election brought new officials who favored centralized dashboards and quick metrics. A rival lab published a glossy report that promised rapid deployment of a new filtration technology. A global health crisis in a distant region shifted donor priorities overnight. Each external shock required the network to adapt without losing its core commitments. She found herself returning again and again to the notebook's rules and to the covenant she had written with her father. They were not magic. They were practices that required daily attention. One evening, after a long day of meetings and a visit to her father's clinic, she sat on the lab's roof with Mara and watched the city's lights ripple like a constellation. Mara nudged her and said, simply, "You've built something that matters." The words were small and true. She touched the pendant in her pocket and felt its familiar warmth. She thought of the apprentices who now led outreach sessions, of the elders who had shared songs for the archive, and of the communities that had insisted on governance that honored their voices. The network hummed below them, a living thing that had roots in many hands. She added a new line to the notebook that night, one that felt like both a warning and a benediction. Guard the tool, teach the practice. Let secrecy be a shield for values, not for power. The pendant warmed in agreement, and she closed the notebook, ready for whatever questions the next season would bring. Legacy and teaching. The years that followed felt less like a climb and more like a widening plain. The network's footprint spread outward in concentric circles. Apprentices became teachers, and the archive's map filled with voices that had once been quiet. She moved through this landscape with a steadiness that had been earned by small, repeated acts, careful documentation, patient negotiation, and the stubborn insistence that communities be partners rather than subjects. The pendant remained a private warmth in her pocket, a reminder of the girl who had once been startled by electric light and who had learned to move through time with care. But the work she now did was less about secret leverage and more about building practices that could be taught, tested, and passed on. Teaching became the axis around which much of her life turned. She designed curricula that combined bench skills with ethical practice, that taught apprentices how to pipette and how to listen, how to write reproducible methods, and how to record the stories that gave those methods meaning. Her classes were crowded and lively. High school students who had never seen a lab before, community health workers who wanted practical tools, and graduate students who needed a reminder that data without context could be dangerous. She taught with the same quiet authority she had used in presentations and in council meetings, but in the classroom she allowed herself more warmth and humor. She told stories about the river, about her grandmother's hands, and about the small rituals that had taught her to respect both machines and people. The pedagogy she developed emphasized apprenticeship over spectacle. Students spent mornings in lectures and afternoons in the field, learning to set up testing stations in markets and to translate results into actionable steps for local leaders. They practiced chain of custody protocols and then sat with elders to hear the stories that explained how a well had been used for generations. She insisted that every technical lesson be paired with a listening exercise. Before proposing an intervention, students had to spend a day simply observing and recording the rhythms of a place. The exercises were sometimes awkward. Students unused to silence found it difficult to sit without offering solutions, but the practice reshaped their instincts. They learned to ask questions that honored local knowledge and to design experiments that fit into the social life of a community. Her teaching extended beyond formal classrooms. She ran intensive mentorship programs that paired apprentices with community leaders for months at a time. The mentorships were reciprocal. Apprentices taught technical skills while learning governance and cultural translation from local partners. The model produced leaders who could move between contexts with humility and competence. One apprentice, Amina, who had grown up in a neighborhood that had once been skeptical of outsiders, became a regional coordinator who could convene councils and translate technical reports into community action plans. Another, Lewis, used the archive to design a campaign that combined water testing with local storytelling, increasing participation in testing by more than half. These successes were not the result of a single person's genius, but of a distributed practice that valued many hands. As she taught, she also wrote. Her papers and essays moved between technical journals and public-facing outlets, arguing that reproducibility required social documentation and that ethical science required community co-ownership. She wrote about the archive and about the ways marginalia and oral histories could illuminate the contingencies behind a method. She argued that funders should value the slow work of trust building and that institutions should fund the labor of documentation as rigorously as they funded equipment. Her writing was careful and persuasive. It drew on case studies from the network and on archival visits that showed how discoveries were built by many hands over time. The essays circulated widely, and they began to shape conversations in funding agencies and in university departments. Recognition came in forms that mattered and in forms that did not. She accepted awards that honored community-engaged science and used the platform to advocate for policy changes that protected data sovereignty and community governance. She declined invitations that would have required her to endorse technologies or products that did not align with the covenant she had helped write. The choices were not always easy. Turning down resources sometimes meant slower growth and harder trade-offs for apprentices who needed stable funding. But she had learned that compromise without principle could hollow out the very things she had worked to build. Her father's health, which had been a slow decline, reached a point where the rhythms of care required more of her time. She rearranged her schedule, delegating operational responsibilities and spending mornings at his bedside, listening to stories that had once seemed like background music, but that now felt like scripture. He asked about the apprentices and about the archive, and she told him of the people who had learned to hold a pipette and to hold a conversation with equal care. He smiled with a tired pride and reminded her, in his practical way, that the work of repair required patience and the willingness to teach others to carry the load. When he died one late autumn, the loss was a quiet, deep thing that reshaped the edges of her life. She grieved in the small rituals her family had always practiced. A meal shared, a story told, a pendant placed briefly on the table as if to honor the continuity of care. The death forced a reckoning with legacy. She had always thought of succession in practical terms: pipelines, rotating councils, mentorship programs. But now the question felt more intimate. What would it mean to pass on not only structures, but also the moral grammar that had guided her choices? She convened a series of retreats with the rotating council and with apprentices who had become leaders. They spoke frankly about values and about the temptations that came with visibility and funding. They rehearsed scenarios: a funder who demanded proprietary data, a municipal official who wanted centralized control, a crisis that required rapid deployment. The rehearsals were not merely hypothetical. They were a way to test the network's muscles and to ensure that the covenant could be enacted by many hands. One of the most consequential outcomes of these retreats was the formalization of a teaching ritual she called the Ledger Day. Once a year, apprentices, community partners, and elders gathered to read aloud the network's notebook, not as a sacred text, but as a living ledger that recorded decisions, mistakes, and the reasoning behind them. They read confessions of error alongside descriptions of successful interventions, and they debated the ethical lines that had guided past choices. Ledger Day was a practice of collective memory and of accountability. It made the network's history transparent to those who had built it and to those who would inherit it. The ritual also served as a test for potential leaders. Could they hold the ledger's contradictions and still act with integrity? The pendant's future remained a guarded question. She had drafted a protocol for its stewardship that combined apprenticeship, ethical review, and a public commitment to the covenant's values. The protocol required candidates to demonstrate not only technical skill, but also a record of community-centered practice and a willingness to be accountable. The small council that oversaw the protocol included elders from partner communities, a legal advisor, and 2 apprentices chosen by the rotating council. The arrangement was imperfect. Secrecy always carries risks, but it reflected the network's attempt to balance the need for guarded stewardship with the imperative of public values. As she moved into a role that emphasized teaching and legacy, she found new pleasures in small things: a student's first careful pipetting, an elder's laugh when a testing station was set up in a market, the way apprentices corrected each other gently in the lab. She took joy in the network's messy, human rhythms: the late-night debriefs after a field deployment, the shared meals that followed a successful workshop, the way a community leader used the archive to craft a petition that led to a municipal repair. These were the moments that made the work feel less like a career and more like a life woven into many others. Her teaching also carried the responsibility of critique. She encouraged students to interrogate the assumptions of their disciplines: who benefits from a given technology, whose labor is made invisible by a neat methods section, and how power shapes what counts as evidence. She taught them to read not only instruments, but also contracts, and to ask hard questions of funders and partners. The pedagogy was demanding because it required students to hold technical excellence and ethical rigor simultaneously. Some found the dual demand exhausting, others found it liberating. Over time, a cohort of leaders emerged who could move between labs and communities with a practiced humility. One of her proudest moments, as a teacher came when a group of apprentices organized a community-led research project without her direct involvement. They had used the archive to design a culturally resonant outreach campaign, trained local volunteers to run testing stations, and negotiated a data-sharing agreement that preserved community sovereignty. The project produced results that led to targeted repairs and to a municipal policy change that improved water access in several neighborhoods. She watched the apprentices present their work at a regional meeting, their voices steady and clear, and felt a fierce, quiet pride. The network had become less dependent on any single person's energy. It had become a living practice carried by many hands. As the seasons turned, she continued to write and to teach, to travel as an advisor, and to sit in circles under mango trees as a learner. The pendant remained a private warmth, but its role had shifted from a tactical instrument to a moral compass, a reminder that power must be stewarded and that the true measure of success is the capacity to teach others to carry the work. She added new lines to the notebook that reflected the network's evolving priorities, commitments to transparency, to community governance, and to the slow work of documentation. In quieter moments, she returned to the river in her memory and to the small rituals that had shaped her earliest sense of belonging. She walked the city's streets with a steadier step, listening to the hum of machines and to the cadence of human voices. The work she had chosen was not finished. It never would be. But she had built practices that could be taught, tested, and passed on. She had learned that legacy was not a monument but a set of habits. How to listen, how to document, how to repair, and how to teach others to do the same. The pendant warmed in her palm as if in agreement, and she closed the notebook with a line that felt like a benediction. Teach so others may lead. Leave the ledger open for those who follow. Breakthroughs and burdens. The lab had become a place where small miracles were practiced rather than awaited. Years of careful rehearsal, of ledger days and apprenticeship, had produced a rhythm in which experiments were not sudden epiphanies, but the slow accretion of small, repeatable acts. It was in that steady cadence that the breakthrough arrived, not as a bolt from the blue, but as the patient resolution of a problem that had haunted the team for months. A method to detect a class of contaminants in water at concentrations far lower than previously possible, using a low-cost assay that could be run with the portable kits. The idea had begun in a margin of the archive, where an old technician's note described a tweak to a reagent ratio that had once stabilized a fragile enzyme. She had stepped back with the pendant to stand beside the technician as he scribbled the note, and she had returned with a clarity that made the tweak feel less like luck and more like a lesson in humility. In the lab, the team iterated. Small changes to buffer composition, a different incubation temperature, a pipetting cadence that minimized shear. They rehearsed runs, documented every micro-adjustment in the ledger, and tested the assay across matrices that mimicked the messy reality of field samples. When the results finally converged, when the assay reliably detected contaminants at the new threshold, and when the portable kits readout matched bench instruments, the room held a kind of stunned, grateful silence. The breakthrough was technical, yes, but its meaning was social. It meant earlier detection, faster responses, and the possibility of preventing illness rather than merely documenting it. The team celebrated in the modest way they had learned to celebrate. A shared pot of tea, a round of quiet congratulations, and a ledger entry that recorded not only the method, but the people who had made it possible. Recognition followed, as it often does, in both helpful and complicated forms. A peer-reviewed journal accepted the method's paper, praising the rigor of the controls and the clarity of the documentation. Funders took notice and offered resources to scale validation across different regions. Community partners saw the potential for earlier interventions. The breakthrough opened doors that had been closed and widened the network's capacity to protect people's health. But with recognition came burdens. The rival lab, which had long favored rapid productization, published a commentary that praised the technical advance but questioned whether the network's governance model could scale without losing fidelity. The commentary was not malicious. It was a professional critique framed in the language of efficiency. Still, it landed in the public conversation as a challenge. Could the slow, community-centered model survive the pressures of scale and the demands of funders who wanted measurable, rapid impact? She felt the pressure in practical ways. Requests for rapid rollouts arrived from municipal partners who wanted the kits deployed citywide within months. Foundations asked for timelines and metrics that fit grant cycles rather than community rhythms. The rotating council convened emergency meetings to translate the technical promise into governance that could preserve local sovereignty. They drafted deployment protocols that required community consent, local training, and a phased validation plan that prioritized fidelity over speed. The plan was slower than some stakeholders wanted, but it honored the covenant. The method would be scaled only in ways that preserved the archive's contextual documentation and the community's control over data. The ethical questions multiplied. A private company offered to manufacture the kits at scale and to distribute them widely. In return, they asked for an exclusive license to the assay's design. The offer promised lower unit costs and faster distribution, but it also threatened to enclose a method that had been developed in conversation with communities and documented in the public ledger. She convened the council and the community partners and laid the offer on the table. The discussion was long and fraught. Some argued that the company's manufacturing capacity could save lives quickly. Others warned that exclusivity would lock communities out of the very tools they had helped shape. They negotiated hard. The company's initial terms were unacceptable. Exclusivity, proprietary formats, and clauses that would limit community access. She and the council proposed an alternative, an open manufacturing license that allowed multiple producers to make the kits under quality assurance standards, a pricing model that prioritized affordability for low-resource settings, and a clause that required any manufacturer to contribute a portion of profits to a community fund governed by the rotating council. The negotiations were tense, and at times, she felt the old temptation to use the pendant to step forward and smooth the path. She resisted. The ledger's rules had taught her that shortcuts corroded trust. In the end, the company agreed to a non-exclusive manufacturing partnership with strict quality controls and a revenue-sharing model that funded apprenticeships and community archives. The agreement was imperfect but defensible. It preserved access, created local manufacturing opportunities in several regions, and funded the network's long-term stewardship. The victory felt like a compromise that honored the covenant while acknowledging the practical need to get kits into hands quickly. Even as the technical and governance work unfolded, personal burdens accumulated. The demands of leadership, the negotiations, the travel, the constant vigilance against extraction, had a cost. She found herself more often exhausted, her patience thinner at home, her notebook margins crowded with reminders she could not always keep. The pendant's warmth in her pocket felt less like a comfort and more like a reminder of the obligations she had accepted. She had built systems to distribute responsibility, but systems still required people who could hold relationships together. A crisis sharpened the tension. A sudden contamination event in a neighboring city produced a political firestorm. Local officials demanded immediate action and sought to use the network's data to justify emergency measures. The rival lab's director seized the moment to propose a centralized dashboard that would aggregate data across cities and feed it to municipal control centers. The proposal promised speed and the appearance of decisive governance, but it also risked stripping data of provenance and of the community narratives that gave it meaning. She and the rotating council faced a choice: allow the data to be centralized under municipal control in the name of rapid response, or insist on community-mediated use that might slow some interventions but preserve consent and context. The decision was agonizing. Lives were at stake. The political pressure was intense. She convened a rapid ethics review with community representatives, legal advisors, and public health experts. They drafted a compromise. Data could be used for emergency response if a rapid consent protocol was enacted, and if community representatives were included in the decision-making process. The protocol required transparency about how data would be used and a commitment to return results and benefits to affected communities. Implementing the protocol in the heat of crisis was messy. There were moments when the municipal officials pushed back, arguing that consent protocols would delay action. There were moments when community leaders, exhausted by repeated emergencies, questioned whether the slow processes were worth the cost. She felt the strain of holding both urgency and ethics in her hands. The pendant's warmth was a small comfort in the long nights of negotiation, but it did not make the choices easier. The crisis also revealed the human cost of leadership. An apprentice she had mentored from the beginning, a woman named Amina who had become a regional coordinator, collapsed from exhaustion after weeks of nonstop deployments. The team rallied to support her, rotating responsibilities and ensuring she received care. The incident was a painful reminder that the network's sustainability depended not only on governance structures, but on the well-being of the people who carried the work. They instituted mandatory rest cycles for deployment teams and created a fund to support mental health and recuperation for apprentices and volunteers. Amid the turbulence, the breakthrough's promise continued to unfold in quieter, life-changing ways. In a small coastal town, early detection of contamination allowed a clinic to intervene before an outbreak spread. A mother who had lost a child to waterborne illness years earlier told the team that the new assay had given her community a chance they had not had before. Those moments, the ones that did not make headlines but that mattered to the people whose lives were touched, were the reason she kept returning to the ledger and to the covenant. She also found time for small, private acts that replenished her. Mara organized a weekend away at a lakeside cabin where they cooked simple meals, walked without agendas, and read aloud from the archive's oral histories. The quiet was restorative. She visited her father's grave on the anniversary of his death and sat by the riverbank where she had once learned to listen. She pressed the pendant to her palm and felt the same small warmth that had steadied her as a child. The rituals of memory and of care were not escapes from responsibility. They were the practices that made responsibility bearable. As the year closed, the network prepared for a regional convening, a gathering of community partners, apprentices, funders, and municipal representatives to reflect on the year's work and to plan the next steps. The agenda was dense: reports on the assay's validation, discussions of governance, workshops on archival practice, and sessions on mental health and rest. She drafted the opening remarks with care, wanting to honor the many hands that had built the year's successes and to name the costs that had been paid. On the morning of the convening, she stood before a room that felt like a map of the network's life. Elders who had contributed songs to the archive, apprentices who had become leaders, municipal officials who had learned to listen, and funders who had accepted the covenant's terms. She spoke not as a triumphant founder, but as a steward who had learned to hold complexity. She read a passage from the ledger that recorded a confession and a repair, and she invited others to speak their truths. The convening was not a celebration of a single person's genius, but a ritual of collective memory and of recommitment. After the sessions, as people dispersed into smaller conversations, she stepped outside into the courtyard and felt the city's air on her face. The pendant in her pocket felt like a small, private compass. She had learned that breakthroughs mattered only insofar as they were embedded in practices that honored people and places. The assay would save lives. The governance would protect dignity. The archive would keep stories alive. The work was far from finished, and the burdens remained real. But in the ledger's margins, in the apprentices' steady hands, and in the elders' songs, she saw the signs of a practice that could endure. She added a line to the notebook that night, one that felt like both a warning and a benediction. Let breakthroughs be bridges, not gates. Let every advance be measured by how it widens the circle of care. The pendant warmed in agreement, and she closed the ledger, ready for the next season of work, for the next set of choices that would test whether the network's values could hold when the world demanded speed and when the people it served demanded justice. Consolidation and passing the torch. The network had reached a scale that made it